The darkness of her presence had swallowed our home whole, casting a long, suffocating shadow over what was supposed to be our sanctuary. "Sign it," she hissed, her voice sounding like dry leaves scraping against pavement. The pen felt like a lead weight in my trembling fingers. It was a simple black ballpoint pen, the kind you find in any kitchen drawer, usually used for grocery lists or children's homework. But today, it was a weapon pointed directly at my heart. I looked down at the stark white paper spread across my mahogany dining table, the table I had polished just yesterday with lemon oil, trying to make the house perfect for her visit. The words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage," screamed up at me in bold, unfeeling capital letters. My vision blurred. A hot, stinging tear escaped my eye and splashed onto the legal document, creating a dark, crinkled spot right next to the line where I was expected to erase 7 years of my life. I looked up, desperate, searching for the man who promised to love me until death parted us. Daniel stood by the window, his broad shoulders slumped, his back turned to me. He was looking out at the rain that had been hammering against the glass all afternoon, refusing to meet my gaze. The silence from him was louder than his mother screaming. It was a physical blow. My chest felt tight, as if an iron band were constricting my lungs, making every breath a shallow, painful gasp. "Are you really going to let her do this?" He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just gripped the windowsill until his knuckles turned white. Margaret snapped, slamming her manicured hand onto the table, making the china's centerpiece rattle. Her rings, heavy with diamonds that had always felt like cold eyes watching me, clicked against the wood. "He has finally seen the light. He knows that a woman of your background was never suitable for the Hamilton legacy." I felt small. I felt like the 20-year-old waitress I was when I met him, not the 28-year-old mother and wife who had poured her soul into this family. In the corner of my eye, I saw movement. My children, my babies. Lily, my sweet 7-year-old with her father's dark eyes, and little Leo, clutching the hem of her shirt. They were huddled in the doorway of the living room, their eyes wide with a terror no child should ever witness. I couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. The pen hovered over the paper. But wait, how did we get to this moment? How did a rainy Tuesday afternoon turn into an execution of my marriage? To understand why my hand was shaking and why the air in the room smelled so heavily of impending doom, I have to take you back to the moment the doorbell rang. It had started as a morning filled with anxiety, the kind that sits in your stomach like a cold stone. I knew Margaret was coming. She always visited on the second Tuesday of the month, a ritual inspection disguised as a family visit. I had been up since 5 in the morning. I scrubbed the baseboards until my knees ached. I made sure the throw pillows were fluffed exactly the way she liked, although she would inevitably rearrange them the moment she sat down. I baked her favorite almond tart, filling the house with a warm, sugary scent that I hoped would mask the fear I felt. I am 28, but around Margaret, I revert to a frightened child. She is a woman made of steel and pearls, carrying the weight of her family's old money like a shield. From the day Daniel brought me home, she made it clear. I was temporary. I was a mistake. I was the daughter of a mechanic and a school teacher, while Daniel was the heir to a real estate empire. She never said it outright in front of Daniel, but when we were alone, her words were sharp little needles. When the doorbell rang at noon, the sound echoed like a gunshot. I wiped my hands on my apron, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The rain was pouring down, turning the world gray, but Margaret stood under the shelter of the porch, perfectly dry, her silver hair immobile, her trench coat pristine. "Lucia," she said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of an unfortunate fact. "Hello, Margaret. Come in, please. It's pouring out there," I said, forcing a smile that felt tight on my face. She stepped inside, bringing with her a gust of cold, damp air and her signature scent, a heavy, cloying mixture of expensive floral perfume and something stale, something ancient, like dust settling in a room that hasn't been opened in decades. "The walkway is slippery," she announced, peeling off her leather gloves. "You should have Daniel hire someone to pressure wash it." "I'll tell him," I murmured, taking her coat. She walked into the living room, her eyes scanning the space like a searchlight looking for flaws. She ran a finger over the mantelpiece, she checked the curtains, then she turned to me, her face devoid of any warmth. "He's in the study." "He took the day off to be here for your visit," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Good, because we have business to discuss." That was the first red flag. Usually, she started with passive-aggressive comments about my cooking or the children's manners. Today, she was direct, cold. There was a glint of triumph in her eyes that made my stomach turn over. Daniel came down the stairs then. He looked tired. The dark circles under his eyes told the story of the stress he'd been under. Pressure at work, pressure from his mother. He kissed my cheek, a quick, distracted peck, before turning to her. "Mother, we need to sit down, Daniel. Now," she said. She didn't look at me. She marched to the dining room and sat at the head of the table, Daniel's seat. I followed, my heart beginning to race. "Can I get you some tea?" "Sit down, Lucia," Margaret commanded. It wasn't a request. I sat. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. Tock, 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 marking the seconds of my life slipping away. Margaret reached into her oversized designer bag. The leather creaked as she pulled out a thick blue folder. She placed it on the table with a heavy thud. "I have been speaking with the family attorneys," she began, her voice steady and calm, terrifyingly calm. "We have conducted a review of the family assets and the vulnerabilities." Daniel asked, rubbing his temples. "This," she said, opening the folder, "is the solution. I have tolerated this charade long enough, Daniel. I have watched you lower yourself, living in this mediocrity," I gasped. The insult was a physical slap. "I am the mother of your grandchildren." She turned her head slowly to look at me, her eyes dead. "You are a placeholder, my dear, and your time is up. Daniel needs a wife who understands our world." She slid the papers toward me. I froze. I looked at Daniel. "You—" Daniel looked agonizingly uncomfortable. She brought it up last week, Lucia." "He told you he didn't want to talk about it," Margaret interrupted, speaking over him as if he were a child. "But he knows I am right. The business is merging with the Sterling Group. The Sterlings are traditional. They expect Daniel to be matched with someone of standing, specifically Vanessa Sterling." I stood up, my legs shaking so hard they knocked the chair back. "This isn't the Middle Ages," Margaret roared. It was the first time she had raised her voice. "You will listen to me, you foolish girl. Daniel's inheritance, his future, the future of my grandchildren, depends on this merger. If he stays with you, he loses his position as CEO. He loses the trust fund. He loses everything. Is that what you want?" She looked at Daniel. "Tell her, Daniel." Daniel looked at me, his eyes wet. "Lucia, it's the whole company. My father's legacy. If I don't, they'll vote me out." I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just hatred, it was blackmail. She was holding his life hostage. I whispered, the betrayal tasting like bile in my throat. Margaret snapped. It's duty, something you wouldn't understand. Now I have had these papers drawn up. They are generous. You will get a small apartment in the city paid for 6 months and a stipend. The scream tore from my throat. Never! You have no income, Margaret said smoothly, smoothing the paper with her claw-like hand. You have no education to speak of, no family connections, no lawyer can beat ours. If you fight this, we will bury you in court fees until you are homeless. We will prove you are unstable. We will take them anyway, and you will get nothing. I looked at Daniel, pleading with my soul. Daniel, please, look at me. This is Lily. This is Leo. Daniel looked down. Lucia, maybe it's for the best. Just for a while. Until I get the company sorted, I can't fight her. He was broken. She had spent a lifetime breaking him, and now she was using the pieces to cut me. Sign it, she said again, pushing the pen into my hand. And that brings us back to the moment. The rain lashing the window, the pen in my hand, the suffocation. I looked at the paper. Full legal and physical custody to Daniel James Hamilton. My hand shook uncontrollably. The ink dot on the paper grew larger as I hesitated. If I signed, I lost them. If I didn't sign, she promised to destroy me, and I believed her. She had the power to make me look like the worst mother on earth. She had the judges in her pocket. I'm waiting, Margaret said, checking her gold watch. I felt a tear slide down my nose. I gripped the pen. I felt like I was dying. The room was spinning. The smell of her perfume was choking me, mixing with the smell of the old, dusty air she seemed to carry with her. Then, a small sound broke the tension. A scuffle of sneakers on the hardwood floor. I froze. Margaret looked up, annoyed. Daniel turned around. Lily! My beautiful, brave 7-year-old daughter walked into the dining room. She was wearing her favorite dinosaur t-shirt and pink leggings, holding her raggedy stuffed bunny by the ear. Her face was pale, but her jaw, so much like mine, was set in a hard line. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at her father. She walked straight up to the table, her small head barely clearing the top of the mahogany surface. She looked at the papers. Then she looked directly at Margaret. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath. Lily, go back to your room, Daniel said, his voice weak and hoarse. No, Lily said. Her voice was small but clear as a bell. She reached out a small hand and placed it over mine, over the hand holding the pen. Her skin was warm, so warm against my ice-cold fingers. She looked up at me, her big brown eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond her 7 years. Lily, please, Margaret said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness that barely concealed her irritation. Grandma is trying to help your daddy. Lily turned her head slowly towards her grandmother. She didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She stood up straighter, pulling her shoulders back, channeling a strength I didn't know she possessed. You're not helping, Lily said. The defiance of her tone made Margaret blink in shock. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Lily took a step closer to the table. She looked at the papers, then at her father, who was staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. She took a deep breath, her little chest puffing out. Margaret let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. You don't get to choose, child. Lily shouted, her voice cracking. I don't care about the law. She pointed a shaking finger at Margaret. You're mean! You always make Mommy cry, Daniel warned, but there was no conviction in it. He was paralyzed. Lily screamed, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. She turned fully to face the matriarch of the Hamilton family, the woman who terrified grown men. You're mean, Grandma, Lily declared, sobbing but fierce. And you smell. You smell like the old closet in the attic where the spiders live. The insult hung in the air, childish yet devastatingly accurate. It cut through the pretense of Margaret's wealth and power, reducing her to exactly what she was, a decaying relic trying to stifle the life out of us. Margaret's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. How dare you! Daniel, control your daughter. She is insolent. She is... But then a sound interrupted her. It was the sound of paper tearing. Rip. Slow, deliberate, loud. I looked up. Daniel had stepped away from the window. He was standing at the table. His hand was on the divorce papers. He looked at Lily, whose chest was heaving with sobs. He looked at me, seeing the terror and the love in my eyes, and then he looked at his mother. Something in his face had changed. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a sudden, burning clarity. The spell she had cast over him for 30 years seemed to shatter in the face of his daughter's courage. Margaret whispered, uncertain for the first time. Daniel didn't answer her. He grabbed the thick stack of documents with both hands. His knuckles were white, veins bulging in his forearms. With a guttural growl that came from deep within his chest, he ripped the papers in half. Rip! He didn't stop there. He put the halves together and tore them again and again. The sound was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of chains breaking. Confetti of legal threats rained down onto the polished mahogany table. Margaret shrieked, standing up. Have you lost your mind? The merger, the money. Daniel leaned over the table, placing both hands flat on the wood, leaning into his mother's space until he was inches from her face. His voice was low, shaking with suppressed rage, but it was steady. No, Mother, he said. He reached out and scooped Lily into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. He reached his other hand out to me. I took it, sobbing, and he pulled me to his side. We stood there, a wall of warmth against her coldness. My daughter is right, Daniel said, his voice hardening into steel. You smell like an old closet. You smell like the past. Margaret gasped, clutching her pearls. I will ruin you. I will cut you off. Daniel pointed to the door. I said, get out of my house, Daniel roared, the sound vibrating through the walls. Take your money. Take your merger. Margaret stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at the torn papers, at Lily glaring at her, at me standing tall beside my husband. She realized, perhaps for the first time in her life, that she had lost. She snatched her bag from the table. You will regret this, Daniel. I'd rather starve with them than feast with you, he spat back. She turned on her heel and marched to the door. The sound of the front door slamming shook the pictures on the walls. Silence returned to the room. But it was different now. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a storm that had just broken. The only sound was the rain outside and Lily's quiet sniffling. Daniel turned to me, his eyes filled with tears and shame. He dropped to his knees, pulling me and Lily into a hug so tight I thought my ribs would crack. I'm so sorry, he sobbed into my stomach. I'm so sorry, Lucia. I was so weak. I ran my fingers through his hair, weeping freely now. We were safe, for now, but as I looked at the torn papers on the table, I knew this wasn't the end. Margaret was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was a woman who plotted revenge. The battle for our home had just begun, but at least now we were fighting on the same side. The silence that followed the slamming of the heavy oak front door was profound, a physical weight that seemed to press down on the four of us. It was as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room along with Margaret, leaving behind a vacuum that we were struggling to fill with our own breath. The grandfather clock in the hallway resumed its rhythmic ticking, but now it didn't sound like a countdown to my execution. It sounded like a heartbeat returning to a body that had nearly died. Daniel was still on his knees, his expensive suit trousers straining against the hardwood floor. He was a big man, broad and tall, the kind of man who usually commanded a room just by standing in it. But in that moment, he looked like a broken boy. He buried his face in the fabric of my apron, his shoulders heaving with silent, racking sobs that vibrated against my stomach. I could feel the wetness of his tears soaking through the cotton, burning my skin like holy water. "I almost did it," he choked out, his voice muffled and thick with self-loathing. "God help me, Lucia. I almost signed it. I held the pen." I wove my fingers through his dark hair, feeling the sweat at his temples. My own hands were trembling so violently I could barely steady them. The adrenaline that had surged through me when Lily spoke was beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, shaking exhaustion. I looked down at my husband, the heir to the Hamilton Empire, kneeling before the daughter of a mechanic, begging for forgiveness. The injustice of what his mother had done, the sheer cruelty of forcing a man to choose between his fortune and his heart, made bile rise in my throat. "But you didn't," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Because of her," he said, lifting his head to look at Lily. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face blotchy and raw. Lily was standing perfectly still next to the table, her little chest rising and falling rapidly. The adrenaline was leaving her too, and I saw the exact moment the realization of what she had done hit her. Her lower lip began to quiver. She dropped her stuffed bunny, the soft thud echoing in the quiet room, and her face crumpled. She whimpered, her voice sounding so much younger than it had just moments ago. "Is Grandma?" The pain on Daniel's face was agonizing to witness. He scrambled to his feet, disregarding his dignity, and scooped her up into his arms again. He buried his face in her small neck, inhaling the scent of her strawberry shampoo, the scent of the child he had almost sold for a merger. "No, baby, no," he promised, his voice fierce and shaking. "She is never taking you. Nobody is taking you. You are staying right here with Mommy and Daddy." "She said I smell like an old closet," Lily sniffled into his shoulder, her small arms wrapping tightly around his neck. A watery, hysterical laugh bubbled up in my chest. "You did, sweetie." I walked over to them, wrapping my arms around both of my saviors. The warmth of their bodies was the only thing keeping me upright. In the corner of my eye, I saw little Leo, who had been hiding behind the heavy velvet curtains of the living room archway. He peeked out, his thumb in his mouth, his wide eyes darting from the torn papers on the floor to his crying father. "Leo, come here, baby," I called out softly. He ran to us, colliding with my legs, and we formed a tight, impenetrable knot in the center of the dining room. For a long time, nobody spoke. We just held on, breathing in the scent of rain and fear and love. trying to glue the pieces of our family back together with sheer force of will. Eventually, Daniel pulled back slightly. He looked at me, really looked at me, with a desperation I had never seen before. He reached out and took my face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the tear tracks on my cheeks. "Lucia," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you have to know, when she threatened the money, it wasn't for me. I don't care about the cars. I don't care about the clubs, but she said she'd ensure you had nothing. She said you'd be on the street. I was so terrified that if I fought her, I'd lose and you'd suffer anyway. I thought." I looked into his eyes, seeing the torture there. He had been raised in a golden cage, taught that money was the only shield against the world. He didn't understand that poverty wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a person. Loss of love was. Loss of dignity was. "Daniel," I said firmly, covering his hands with mine, "my father fixed transmissions for 30 years with arthritis in his hands so I could have braces. My mother graded papers until midnight so we could go on vacation once a year. We didn't have a trust fund, we didn't have a mansion, but we had a home." I took a deep breath, needing him to understand this. "I would rather live in a one-bedroom apartment with you and the kids, eating rice and beans every night, than live in this mausoleum without you. Do you understand? Your mother, she thinks money is oxygen, but it's not." I pointed to the floor where the shredded remains of the divorce decree lay scattered like dirty snow, just like that. Daniel stared at the torn document. He released me slowly and knelt down again, but this time not in despair. He began to gather the pieces. He picked up the section that said petition, crumpling it in his large fist. He picked up custody, crushing it until his knuckles turned white. He swept the jagged confetti into a pile, his movements jerky and angry. "She's going to do it, Lucia," he said, not looking up. "She wasn't bluffing. She controls the board. She controls the family trust. The house, the deed is in the trust's name." The reality of his words hit me like a splash of ice water. Eviction. The word tasted metallic. This house, where I had brought both my babies home from the hospital, where I had planted roses in the garden, where I had spent hours choosing the paint color for the nursery, it wasn't ours. It never had been. It was hers, just another asset in her portfolio. "Then let her," I said, my voice surprising me with its steadiness. "Let her have the house. It's cold anyway." Daniel looked up, a handful of paper trash in his grip. "I have some savings. My own savings, separate from the trust. It's not much, not by her standards. Maybe enough for a few months if we're careful. But my job." "You have a degree," I reminded him. "You're smart. You're hardworking when she's not breathing down your neck. You'll find something else." "I've never interviewed for a job in my life," he confessed, the shame coloring his cheeks pink. "Then you'll learn," I said, reaching down to help him pick up the papers. "I'll help you. I know how to write a resume. I know how to budget. Welcome to the real world, Daniel." We finished cleaning up the mess Margaret had left behind. I took the crumpled ball of legal threats and threw it into the fireplace. I grabbed the long lighter from the mantel, ignited it, and held the flame to the edge of the paper. We watched in silence as the fire caught, curling the edges, turning the black legal jargon into gray ash. The words, "dissolution of marriage," blackened and crumbled, disappearing up the chimney in a wisp of smoke. It felt like a ritual, a cleansing. "I need a drink," Daniel muttered, rubbing his face. "I'll make coffee," I said. "Strong coffee." I went into the kitchen, my sanctuary. The almond tart I had baked for her sat on the counter, untouched, mocking me with its perfect golden crust. I stared at it for a moment, feeling a surge of irrational anger. I had spent 3 hours on that tart. I had peeled the almonds by hand. I picked up the plate and, with a sudden, violent motion, scraped the entire tart into the trash bin. The heavy thud of the pastry hitting the bottom of the can felt incredibly satisfying. I started the coffee machine, the familiar gurgle and hiss comforting me. Through the window above the sink, I watched the rain lashing against the backyard swing set. The sky was a bruised purple, darkness falling early. Suddenly, the phone on the wall rang. I jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was the landline. Only one person called the landline. I stared at it. Daniel walked into the kitchen, freezing when he heard the shrill ring. We looked at each other. "Don't answer it," Daniel said. "It could be emergencies," I said weakly, though we both knew it wasn't. It rang again and again. Daniel walked over and pulled the cord out of the wall. The silence returned. "She's starting," he said grimly. "She's calling the lawyers. She's freezing the accounts." I poured the coffee into 2 mugs, my chipped ceramic one with a cat on it, and his sleek gray one. I handed him his mug. His hands were steadier now, but his eyes were haunted. "We need to pack," I said. He looked at me as if I were crazy.
"If she owns the house, she can send security. She can send police. I don't want my children watching us get thrown out by a sheriff," I said, the survival instinct of a mechanic's daughter kicking in. "We pack the essentials, clothes, the kids' favorite toys, documents, passports, birth certificates." "You heard her, Daniel. She hates me. And now she hates you too because you chose me." Daniel took a long sip of coffee, the hot liquid seeming to inject some steel back into his spine. He set the mug down with a clatter. "You're right. You're always right about people's nature." He looked around the kitchen, his eyes landing on the height chart we had penciled onto the doorframe for the kids. He reached out and touched the little pencil marks. "We can take the memory," I said softly, walking up behind him and resting my head on his back. "We take pictures?" he asked. "If the accounts are frozen." "I might have cash in the safe upstairs, a few thousand." "My parents," I said. "They have the spare room. It's small. We'll be sleeping on an air mattress, but they won't turn us away." Daniel let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Your father? He thought you were soft," I admitted. Daniel turned around in my arms. "But you stayed. That's what matters." We went upstairs. The mood in the house had shifted from terror to a grim, determined efficiency. I went to Lily's room. She was sitting on her bed, still holding the bunny, staring at the wall. "Lilybug," I said, trying to keep my voice light, "we're going to play a game. It's called Adventure Pack. We need to put your absolute favorite clothes and toys in this suitcase." Lily looked at me with those knowing eyes. I sat down on the bed next to her. I decided then and there not to lie to her. She had saved us. She deserved the truth, or at least a version of it. "Grandma Margaret is very angry because Daddy didn't do what she wanted," I explained, smoothing her hair. "And because she's angry, she might not let us stay in this house anymore. But that's okay, because a house is just a box of wood and brick." Lily nodded solemnly. She slid off the bed and walked to her closet. "I'm taking my dinosaur shirt," she announced. "Good choices," I said, blinking back tears. For the next 2 hours, we moved through the mansion like ghosts. We didn't take the silver. We didn't take the expensive art. We took the photo albums. I took the quilt my grandmother made me. Daniel took his laptop and a box of files from his study, evidence, he said, just in case he needed to protect himself legally. As I was folding clothes in our bedroom, I looked at the walk-in closet. It was filled with designer dresses Margaret had pressured Daniel to buy for me, things I wore to galas where I felt like an imposter, draped in silk that cost more than my father made in a month. I left them, all of them.
I packed my jeans, my comfortable sweaters, the t-shirts I wore to paint with the kids. Daniel came in, carrying 2 duffel bags. He looked at the closet full of abandoned luxury. He asked, "I'm taking my wedding ring," I said, twisting the simple gold band on my finger, "and the locket you gave me when Leo was born. The rest, the diamonds she gave me for Christmas, the pearls, leave them." He nodded. I emptied the safe. "We have about $4,000 in cash. And I found the emergency credit card I opened years ago, the one under my middle name." "It's a start," I said. We carried the bags downstairs to the foyer. It was 9 o'clock at night now. The rain was still hammering against the roof, a relentless drumbeat. I asked, looking at the pile of luggage. It looked pathetic against the grandeur of the marble entryway. 7 years of marriage reduced to 4 suitcases and a few boxes. "No," Daniel said, his jaw setting. "I'm not running away in the middle of the night like a criminal. We sleep here, one last night. If she sends someone, let them come." It was a risky move, but I respected it. He was reclaiming his manhood, piece by piece. We put the kids to bed, but neither of them wanted to sleep alone, so we dragged the mattresses off their beds and pulled them into our room, creating a giant, soft island on the floor. We all lay there in the dark, the 4 of us tangled together under blankets. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like a car door slamming. I lay there listening to Daniel's breathing, which was shallow and uneven. He wasn't sleeping either. "Hey?" he whispered into the darkness. "She's going to try to say I'm unfit," he said, his voice trembling again. "She'll use tonight. She'll say I'm unstable." "We have witnesses," I said fiercely. "We have the truth. And Lily is strong." Daniel let out a weak chuckle. He reached out and found my hand in the dark. His grip was tight, desperate. "I love you, Lucia. I know I haven't shown it the way I should have. I let her walk all over you. I let her make you feel small." "You tore them when it mattered," I said, bringing his knuckles to my lips. "You broke the cycle, Daniel. That's the hardest thing a person can do." We lay in silence for a while longer. The storm outside was intensifying, thunder rumbling in the distance like approaching artillery. "Let it start," I answered, feeling a fire kindle in my own chest, a fierce, protective heat that banished the cold of the Hamilton mansion. I closed my eyes, but sleep was a distant dream. I lay there, plotting. If she froze the accounts, I would sell my car. It was a modest sedan, not in the trust's name. If she blocked Daniel from getting a job in the city, we would move. We would go somewhere where the name Hamilton meant nothing. I imagined Margaret sitting in her penthouse right now, sipping scotch, speaking to lawyers, arranging the destruction of her own son. She thought she was powerful. She thought she had stripped us naked. But as I felt Leo's warm breath on my arm and Daniel's protective arm across my waist, I realized she was the naked one. She was alone in a tower of gold, shivering, while we were huddled together in the warmth of a mess we had made ourselves. Suddenly, a loud crash from downstairs shattered the stillness. Glass breaking. We all bolted upright. Leo started to cry immediately. "Stay here," Daniel hissed, rolling off the mattress. He grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the bedside table. His face was a mask of terrified determination. "Daniel, no!" I grabbed his arm. "The phone is unplugged," he reminded me. "I'm coming with you," I said. "No, you stay with the kids." He didn't wait for an argument. He slipped out of the room, the brass lamp raised like a club. I scrambled to the door and locked it, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. I backed up to the mattress, gathering the children into my arms. "Shh," I whispered to Leo. "It's just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. I heard heavy footsteps on the marble stairs. 1, 2, 3. Then Daniel's voice shouting, "Who's there?" And then a voice I didn't recognize. A man's voice. Calm, professional, cold. "Mr. Hamilton, we are private security contracted by the Hamilton Trust." My blood ran cold. She hadn't waited for morning. She had sent her soldiers in the middle of the night. "Daniel!" yelled. I heard a scuffle, a thud. I screamed. "Open this door, Mrs. West." "Hamilton!" the voice called out from the hallway, closer now. "We have a court order for immediate eviction due to potential destruction of assets." I looked at my children. Lily was wide-eyed, clutching her dinosaur shirt. Leo was sobbing silently. "Put your shoes on," I commanded, my voice turning into sheer steel. Margaret wanted a war? She had just invaded the wrong mother's home. I looked around for a weapon, my eyes landing on the heavy metal base of the floor fan. I grabbed it. "Lily," whispered. "It's okay, baby," I said, walking towards the door. "We're leaving, but we're walking out with our heads up." I unlocked the door and threw it open. I stepped into the hallway. The heavy metal base of the fan gripped tightly in my hand, my knuckles white with the strain. The scene before me was a nightmare painted in the dim light of the sconces. Daniel was pressed against the floral wallpaper, his arm twisted behind his back by a man who looked less like a security guard and more like a wall of muscle in a cheap suit. Another man stood at the top of the stairs, blocking the descent, his face impassive, holding a tablet as if he were checking inventory in a warehouse, not destroying a family's life. "Let him go," I said, my voice low and trembling with a rage I didn't know I possessed. The man holding Daniel didn't even blink. He looked at me, then down at the fan base in my hand, and a smirk ghosted across his lips. It was a look of pity mixed with contempt, the look the powerful give to the desperate. "Mrs. Hamilton," the man with the tablet said, his voice smooth and oily, "please put down the weapon. We don't want to call the police and have child services involved." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Child services. Margaret knew exactly where to strike. She knew I would burn the world down for Daniel, but I would surrender my soul for my children. If I fought, if I swung this metal base and cracked a skull, she would take them. She would paint me as a violent, unstable woman from the wrong side of the tracks, and she would win. I lowered the fan base. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. "Let him go," I repeated, my voice cracking. "We are leaving." The man nodded to his partner. The grip on Daniel released. Daniel slumped forward, gasping, rubbing his shoulder. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with humiliation. To be manhandled in his own home in front of his wife, while his children cowered in a bedroom behind me, it was a spiritual castration. Margaret wasn't just evicting us. She was trying to emasculate him so thoroughly that he would crawl back to her. "You have 5 minutes," the man said, checking his watch. "The trust has deemed the property at risk." Daniel spat, straightening his jacket, trying to regain a shred of dignity. "Because we burned a piece of paper? This is my house." "Technically," the man droned, "the house belongs to the Hamilton Family Trust. You are merely a tenant at will, and that will has been revoked. 5 minutes, Mr. Hamilton." I turned back to the bedroom. Lily was standing in the doorway, holding Leo's hand. They were both fully dressed, their shoes on the wrong feet in their haste, clutching their backpacks. Lily's face was pale, her eyes huge and dark, absorbing every ounce of the tension. She looked at her father, then at the strange men. "Come on," I whispered, shepherding them into the hall. We moved like refugees in a war zone. I grabbed the 2 duffel bags we had packed. Daniel took the suitcases. We walked past the security guards, who watched us with dead, shark-like eyes. They didn't offer to help. They just stood there, the enforcers of a billionaire's tantrum. As we descended the grand staircase, I looked at the portraits on the wall. Generations of Hamiltons, stern men in suits, women in pearls. They all looked miserable. I realized then that this house had never been a home. It was a museum of cold ambition. The banister under my hand felt like ice. "Wait!" Daniel stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "My keys." "On the table," I pointed. He grabbed the keys to my sedan. His Porsche keys were there too, but he left them. He knew. That car was leased by the company. If we took it, she would report it stolen. We were leaving with exactly what we owned: our clothes, my old car, and each other. The front door was open. The storm was raging outside, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Rain lashed against the porch, blowing into the foyer, soaking the expensive Persian rug. "Out," the guard said from the top of the stairs. We stepped out onto the porch. The door slammed shut behind us instantly. The sound echoed like a gunshot, final and deafening. Then came the metallic click of the deadbolt sliding home. We were alone in the dark. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. The cold was shocking, a physical blow after the heated air of the house. I huddled the children closer to me, trying to shield them with my body. "To the car!" Daniel yelled over the wind. We splashed through the puddles on the driveway. The rain soaked us to the bone in seconds. My sweater became heavy and sodden, clinging to my skin. Leo was screaming now, a terrified wail that was lost in the thunder. I fumbled with the back door of my 10-year-old sedan, shoving the wet bags onto the floor, buckling the children in with shaking, slippery hands. "It's an adventure," I shouted to them, though my teeth were chattering, "like camping." Lily just stared at me, water dripping from her nose, her dinosaur shirt clinging to her chest. She didn't believe me. She was 7, but tonight, she had aged 10 years. I climbed into the passenger seat. Daniel was already behind the wheel, his hands gripping it so tight the leather creaked. He was staring at the house, his house, dark and looming against the purple sky. Through the windows, we could see the flashlights of the security guards moving around, checking rooms, securing her assets. "She did it," Daniel whispered. "Drive, Daniel," I said, putting my hand on his wet knee. He turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. It wasn't a purring sports car engine. It was a noisy, reliable rattle. He threw it into gear, and we peeled out of the driveway, the tires spinning on the wet gravel before catching the asphalt. We didn't look back. The drive was silent, except for the rhythmic thwack-thwack of the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. The city lights blurred into streaks of neon and gray. Every street lamp we passed felt like a spotlight on our failure. We were homeless. The heir to the Hamilton fortune and his family, driving through the rain with $4,000 in a duffel bag and nowhere to go but down. But as the miles put distance between us and the mansion, the knot in my chest began to loosen. The air in the car was damp and smelled of wet wool and fear, but it was our air. Nobody was watching us. "Nobody was judging us?" Lily asked from the back seat, her voice small. "Grandpa and Grandma's," I said, turning to look at her. "You know how Grandma makes those sopapillas you like." "It's late," Lily said. "Grandma and Grandpa are never asleep when family needs them," I promised. We drove out of the wealthy district, past the gated communities with their manicured lawns and silent, judgmental windows. We drove past the high-end shopping centers where Margaret bought her affection. Slowly, the scenery changed. The streets became narrower. The houses sat closer together, some with peeling paint, some with chain-link fences, but all of them with life. We pulled up to my parents' house in the mechanics district 40 minutes later. It was a small, single-story bungalow with a porch that listed slightly to the left, but the yellow porch light was burning. It was a beacon in the storm. Daniel killed the engine. He sat there for a moment, the silence rushing back in. He let his head drop onto the steering wheel, and his shoulders began to shake. "I can't go in there," he choked out. "Lucia, I can't. Your father, he knows. He knows I failed. I promised him on our wedding day I'd take care of you. Look at us." My heart broke for him. The pride of a man is a fragile thing, and Margaret had taken a sledgehammer to his. I unbuckled my seatbelt and leaned over, pulling his face toward mine. "Look at me." He opened his eyes. They were red and full of despair. "You kept the most important promise," I told him fiercely. "You chose us." A weak man would have signed those papers. A weak man would be sleeping in silk sheets right now, knowing he sold his daughter for a trust fund. You are the strongest man I know, and my father respects a man who gets his hands dirty. He took a shaky breath, nodding slowly. "Okay." We got out of the car. The rain had softened to a drizzle. I walked up the concrete path to the door I had walked through 1,000 times as a child. I didn't even have to knock. The door swung open before I reached the mat. My mother stood there in her flannel robe, her hair in rollers, her face etched with worry. My father was behind her, wearing his undershirt and work pants, looking like he was ready to fight a bear. Mom gasped, seeing our soaked clothes, the children shivering behind us. "Oh, Dios mío!" She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask why we were there at midnight. She just opened her arms. "Get inside!" my father barked, but his voice was thick with emotion. He pushed past us and scooped a sleeping Leo out of Daniel's arms. "Get in! Get in!" We tumbled into the living room. It smelled of lemon polish and old books and lingering garlic from dinner. It was cluttered. There were ceramic figurines on the mantel, a crochet blanket on the sofa, and photos of us everywhere. It was small, it was crowded, and it was the warmest place on earth. "I'll get towels," Mom said, already rushing to the linen closet. My father set Leo down gently on the sofa and turned to Daniel. Daniel stood by the door, dripping water onto the linoleum, looking like a lost puppy. He couldn't meet my father's eyes. My father, a man with grease permanently under his fingernails and a back bent from 30 years of labor, walked up to the son of a billionaire. He looked at Daniel's ruined suit, his wet hair, his tear-stained face. Then he did something I had never seen him do to Daniel. He pulled him into a bear hug, a rough, hard, backslapping embrace that knocked the wind out of him. "You're home, son," Dad said, his voice gruff. Daniel crumbled. He buried his face in my father's shoulder and let go. The sound of his grief was raw, a mixture of relief and pain that filled the small room. My father just held him, patting his back with a hand that felt like sandpaper, anchoring him to the earth. I sat on the floor with Lily, peeling off her wet socks. Mom came back with a stack of warm towels and started rubbing Lily's hair vigorously. "The kettle is on," Mom said, looking at me with fierce, intelligent eyes. "When the kids are asleep, you tell us everything, and then we figure it out." I looked around the room. The wallpaper was peeling in the corner. The carpet was worn. We had no money. We had no plan. We had a powerful enemy who wanted to crush us. But as I watched my father pouring brandy into a mug for my shaking husband, and my mother wrapping my daughter in a quilt that smelled of lavender, I realized something profound. Margaret had the house. She had the lawyers. She had the millions. But she was the poorest woman in the world. "Here," Mom handed me a mug of hot chocolate. Drink. I took a sip. The sweetness hit my tongue, chasing away the metallic taste of fear. I leaned my head back against the worn sofa cushion and closed my eyes for just a second. Lily asked from under the quilt. I opened my eyes and looked at Daniel, who was sitting at the kitchen table now, listening to my father talk about fixing the transmission on the sedan. He looked exhausted, but the color was returning to his face. For now, Bug, I said softly, this is base camp. We're going to build our own home. No, I smiled, a genuine, dangerous smile. The phone in the kitchen rang. It was an old rotary phone that hung on the wall. The sound was jarring in the cozy atmosphere. My father frowned. He went to answer it. I sat up, my instincts screaming. It couldn't be. Dad said. He listened for a moment, his face darkening. The lines on his forehead deepened into canyons. He didn't say a word, just listened. His knuckles turned white on the receiver. He slammed the phone down so hard the bell inside jingled. Mom? Asked, stopping her drying. My father turned to look at us, his eyes blazing with a protective fury I hadn't seen since I was a teenager being bullied. A lawyer, he said, his voice low and dangerous. He says he represents the Hamilton Trust. He looked at Daniel, then at me, struggling to get the words out. He says they are filing an emergency motion for custody tomorrow morning. They claim we are kidnapping the children and holding them in... The silence that followed was absolute. The warmth of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Daniel stood up slowly. The grief was gone from his face, replaced by something cold and hard. He looked less like the boy who cried on the floor and more like the man who had torn the papers. Substandard, Daniel repeated, looking around the modest, loving home. He walked over to where I was sitting and pulled me to my feet. He held my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away a stray tear. He said, his voice steady, vibrating with a new, terrifying resolve. She thinks she can take my children because we don't have a mansion? I whispered, feeling the electricity coming off him. She forgot that I know where the bodies are buried, he said darkly. I managed her accounts for 5 years before she pushed me out. I know about the offshore shells. I know about the tax evasion. I never used it because she was my mother. He turned to my father. Carlos, do you still know that guy? The one who writes for the city paper? My father grinned, a slow, predatory baring of teeth. Jose? Yeah, I fix his car for free. Call him, Daniel said. Call him now. If she wants a court battle, we'll give her one. I looked at my husband, really looked at him. The expensive suit was ruined, stained with rain and sweat. He had no money. He had no house. But standing there in my parents' kitchen, plotting to take down the Hamilton Empire with nothing but the truth and a mechanic's phone connection, he looked like a king. Make the coffee, Mom, I said, grabbing a notepad from the counter. The storm outside was still raging, battering the little house, but inside, the fire was just starting to burn. We weren't victims anymore. We were a family at war. And as I looked at my sleeping children, safe under the handmade quilts, I knew one thing for certain. Margaret had started this fire, but we were going to be the ones to watch her burn. The smell of brewing coffee in my parents' kitchen was different from the coffee at the Hamilton mansion. There, the coffee tasted like burnt hazelnuts and was served in bone china so thin I was always afraid I'd crush it. Here, the coffee was thick, dark, and smelled like earth and survival. It smelled like my childhood. My mother, Maria, moved around the small kitchen with a silent, frantic energy. She wasn't just making coffee, she was building a fortress. She pulled out a bag of flour, a block of lard, and the big wooden rolling pin that had been in our family for 3 generations. At 1 a.m., with thunder shaking the window panes, she was making tortillas. It was her way of telling the universe that no matter what happened, we would eat. We would be warm. I watched Daniel. He was sitting at the small formica table, his knees bumping against the metal legs. He had stripped off his wetsuit jacket and tie. In my father's oversized flannel shirt, which hung loosely on his frame, he looked younger, more vulnerable, yet somehow more dangerous than I had ever seen him. He was staring at the notepad, his pen scratching furiously against the paper. He wasn't just writing notes, he was dissecting his past to save our future. My father asked. He was leaning against the counter, arms crossed over his chest, watching Daniel with a mixture of respect and concern. Once you ring this bell, you cannot unring it. She is your mother. Daniel stopped writing. He didn't look up immediately. His hand trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the adrenaline crashing through his veins. When he raised his head, his eyes were dry and hard as flint. "She isn't a mother, Carlos," Daniel said, his voice raspy. "A mother protects, a mother nurtures. Margaret, she is a corporation in a human suit. She was willing to let my children, her own grandchildren, sleep on the street tonight just to prove a point. She wanted to break me." He looked at me then, and the hardness in his eyes softened into something agonizingly tender. My heart swelled so painfully in my chest, I had to look away. I walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. He covered my hand with his, squeezing tight. A heavy knock at the front door made us all jump. "That's Jose," Dad said, pushing off the counter. My father opened the door to a gust of wind and rain. Jose stood there, a short, stocky man with a face weathered by too many cigarettes and too many years chasing stories that powerful people wanted buried. He shook his umbrella out on the porch and stepped inside, bringing the smell of the storm with him. "Carlos," Jose nodded to my father, then looked at the rest of us. His eyes landed on Daniel. He didn't look impressed by the Hamilton name. In this neighborhood, that name usually meant layoffs and gentrification. So, "Come in, Jose." "Sit," Mom said, already pouring a mug of coffee. "You want something to eat?" "Coffee is fine, Maria," Jose said, sitting opposite Daniel. He pulled a battered voice recorder from his pocket and set it on the table between them. It looked like a toy compared to the high-tech gadgets Margaret's lawyers used, but right now it felt like the most powerful weapon in the room. "Your father-in-law says you have a story," Jose said, his voice flat. "He says you want to talk about the Hamilton Trust. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Hamilton." "This isn't a spat," Daniel said. He pushed the notepad toward Jose. "And I'm not a rich kid anymore. As of 2 hours ago, I'm homeless." Jose raised an eyebrow. He picked up the notepad. As he read the bullet points Daniel had scribbled, his posture changed. He leaned in. The cynicism faded from his face, replaced by the hunger of a hunter spotting prey. Jose whispered, tapping the paper. "I can prove she drained it," Daniel corrected him. 200 families, people who worked for the manufacturing division for 30 years. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic slap, slap of my mother shaping tortillas. I felt sick. I knew Margaret was cold, but this was stealing the livelihood of people just like my parents, Jose asked, turning on the recorder. Daniel took a deep breath. He began to speak. He told Jose everything. He described the dinner, the divorce papers sliding across the polished mahogany table. He described Lily standing up on her chair, her little voice brave and shaking. He described the security guards, the eviction, the rain, the fear.
As he spoke, I watched my husband transform. He was shedding the Hamilton skin, layer by layer. He wasn't protecting the family reputation anymore. He was burning it to the ground to keep us warm. I went to the bedroom to check on the children. The room was small, crowded with the sewing machine my mother used to hem neighbors' pants for extra cash. Lily and Leo were curled up together on the narrow twin bed, under a thick quilt patchworked from my old clothes. Lily moved in her sleep, her brow furrowed. Even in her dreams, she was worried. I brushed the hair off her forehead, feeling the dampness still clinging to the strands. "I promise you," I whispered to the dark room. When I returned to the kitchen, the interview was over. Jose was packing up his recorder, his face grim but satisfied. "I can get this online in 2 hours," Jose said, standing up and buttoning his raincoat. "The print edition is already put to bed, but the website, this will wake the city up." He shook Daniel's hand. It wasn't a polite handshake, it was a grip of solidarity. "She will come for you," Jose warned. "Let her come," Daniel said. After Jose left, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. My father turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the warm glow of the stove lamp. "Go to sleep," Dad said gently. "We will take the first watch." Daniel and I lay down on the pull-out sofa in the living room. The springs creaked and the mattress was thin, but as Daniel pulled me into his arms, I felt safer than I had in 5 years of sleeping on an orthopedic mattress imported from Italy. We lay there in the semi-darkness, listening to the rain tap against the roof. "The storm was passing," Daniel whispered. "Did you mean it?" I turned to face him. His eyes were adjusting to the dark, seeking mine. "I meant every word. We don't need her money, Daniel. Look at my parents. They have nothing in the bank, but they have everything that matters." He kissed my forehead, his lips lingering there. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely a breath. "I've never been poor before. I don't know how to fix a car." "You have a net," I said, taking his hand and placing it over my heart. "You have me. You have us." We fell into a restless sleep, tangled together under the crochet blanket. I woke up to the smell of frying dough and the sound of laughter. For a second, I panicked, not knowing where I was. Then I saw the peeling floral wallpaper and remembered. I sat up. The sun was streaming through the sheer curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The rain had stopped. I walked into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. The scene before me made my throat tighten. Leo was sitting on my father's lap, steering my dad's coffee mug like a car. Lily was standing on a stool next to my mother at the stove. She was covered in flour, a crooked smile on her face. "Leo," Lily asked, dropping a piece of dough into the hot oil. "Perfecto, mi amor," Mom said, kissing the top of her head. "It will puff up like a cloud." And there, sitting at the table, was Daniel. He was wearing an old t-shirt of my brother's that was too tight in the shoulders. He was holding a fresh sopapilla, dripping with honey, and he was laughing. A real laugh. Not the polite, restrained chuckle he used at gala dinners. A belly laugh. He looked up and saw me. The joy in his face didn't vanish, but it was joined by a flash of intense determination. "Morning," he said. "Come eat," I asked, grabbing a napkin to wipe the flour off Lily's cheek. Daniel pulled a folded newspaper from under his elbow. It wasn't the big city paper. It was the local tabloid Jose wrote for. But the headline was bold, black, and impossible to miss. "It's online, too," Daniel said quietly. "It's trending," I asked, fear pricking at my neck again. "Everyone," Daniel said. "Reporters, former employees, but mostly lawyers. Not her lawyers. Lawyers who want to represent us." My father chuckled, a deep rumble in his chest. Just then, the phone on the wall rang again. It was a harsh, jarring sound in the morning light.
The laughter in the kitchen died instantly. Lily froze, the sopapilla halfway to her mouth. "It's her," Lily whispered. Daniel stood up. He walked over to the wall phone. He didn't look terrified anymore. He looked like a man who was done running. He picked up the receiver. "Hello, Mother," he said. His voice was calm, icy. I couldn't hear what Margaret was screaming on the other end, but I could hear the distortion of her voice, high and shrill. Daniel listened for a long moment, his expression unmoving. "No," Daniel interrupted her. "No, you don't get to demand anything anymore. You kicked us out. You made us tenants at will, remember?" He paused, listening again. Then a small, dark smile touched his lips. "Go ahead, freeze the accounts, take the trust, burn it all for all I care." Silence on the line. Daniel said, leaning against the wall, looking casually confident in a way that made my knees weak. "I haven't even talked about the offshore accounts in Panama yet, Mother." He waited a beat. "That's what I thought." He hung up the phone. He didn't slam it. He placed it back on the hook gently, with the precision of a surgeon finishing an operation. He turned to us. The kitchen was silent. My mother was holding the spatula like a scepter. My father was grinning. I asked, breathless. "She said we're making a mistake," Daniel said, walking back to the table and picking up his honey-covered pastry. Daniel looked at Lily, covered in flour. He looked at Leo, safe in his grandfather's arms. He looked at me, messy hair and wearing borrowed pajamas, standing in a kitchen that smelled of love and fried dough. But the peace was fragile. We knew that. A wounded animal bites harder, and Margaret Hamilton was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was regrouping. She was planning. Lily asked, tugging on my sleeve. I looked at the clock. It was 8:30 a.m. In our old life, the chauffeur would be driving them to the private academy right now. "No, baby," I said. "Not today." "We have to find a lawyer," I said, looking at Daniel. "A real one. Because she backed down now, but she'll be back." "I know a guy," my father said, setting Leo down. "He's not fancy. His office is above the laundromat on 4th Street, but he fights like a pit bull." "Call him," Daniel said. As my father dialed, I went to the window and looked out at the street. A black sedan was driving slowly past the house. Tinted windows, expensive tires. It slowed down as it passed our driveway, then sped up and disappeared around the corner. A chill went down my spine. They were watching. "Daniel," I called out, my voice tight. He was at my side in a second. "I saw it," he said grimly. "Of course she knows. She has trackers on everything. The phones, the old car." He put his arm around me, pulling me away from the window. "We need to be smart, Lucia. We have the public on our side for now, but the news cycle moves fast. By tomorrow, people will forget. She can pay a doctor to say I'm bipolar. She can pay a teacher to say the kids look neglected. Money buys truth, Lucia." "Not this time," I said, grabbing his face. "This time, truth is free." The rest of the day passed in a blur of strategy. The kitchen table became our command center. My mother kept the coffee and food coming, feeding us as if calories were ammunition. We met with my father's lawyer friend, Mr. Zulai. Garrus, a man with coffee stains on his tie and a mind as sharp as a razor. He listened to Daniel, took notes, and laughed when he heard about the fan base I had brandished. "You're a wild one, Mrs. Hamilton," Garrus wheezed. "I like that." By evening, the storm outside had returned, matching the turmoil inside our hearts. We were exhausted. Every time a car door slammed outside, we jumped. Every time the phone rang, we flinched. I was tucking Lily into bed again when she asked the question that broke me. I sat on the edge of the bed, struggling to find an answer that wouldn't poison her heart. How do you explain to a child that some people have a hole inside them where love should be and they fill it with gold coins instead? She doesn't hate you, Lily, I said softly. She loves winning more than she loves people, and she's confused. I don't want to be owned, Lily said firmly. And you will be. I kissed her goodnight and went out to the porch. Daniel was sitting on the swinging bench, watching the rain. He had a beer in his hand, cheap domestic beer my father drank. I sat next to him. He didn't say anything, just rested his head on my shoulder. "I'm sorry," he whispered after a long time, "for taking so long to wake up, for letting you endure her for 7 years." "You were a son," I said. "It's hard to kill the part of you that wants your mother's approval." He took a sip of beer. "I lost my inheritance today. Billions. It's all gone. I'll probably never work in finance again." I shrugged, leaning into him. He laughed, a soft, tired sound. "We're going to be better than okay." Suddenly, the headlights of a car swept across the porch, blinding us. A vehicle pulled into the driveway. It wasn't a black sedan this time. It was a police cruiser. The lights on top flashed silently, blue and red, painting the wet siding of my parents' house in hysterical colors. Daniel stood up, the beer bottle slipping from his hand and shattering on the concrete. "No," he groaned. 2 officers stepped out of the car. They walked up the path, their hands resting near their belts. They didn't look like they were here for a friendly chat. "Quid?" the older officer asked, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "That's me," Daniel said, stepping in front of me instinctively. "We have a warrant for your arrest," the officer said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "And," I screamed, grabbing Daniel's arm, "for what?" "Corporate espionage and embezzlement," the officer recited, walking up the steps, "and theft of sensitive proprietary data." I shouted, "She's lying!" "You can tell it to the judge, ma'am," the officer said. "Turn around, mister." My parents were at the door now, attracted by the lights. My mother gasped. My father looked ready to charge, but Daniel held up a hand. "Don't, Carlos," Daniel said calmly. "Don't give them a reason to arrest you, too." He looked at me. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. "Call Garris," he told me, "and call Jose. Tell him she escalated." "Daniel, please," I was sobbing now, clutching his shirt. "I love you, Lucia," he said as the officer spun him around. I heard the metallic click, click of the handcuffs. The sound was sickening. It was the sound of the system crushing the little guy. They marched him down the steps in the rain. He didn't struggle. He walked with his head high, unlike the night before when he had been hunched in shame. He was a criminal in the eyes of the law, but a hero in the eyes of his family. As they shoved him into the back of the cruiser, I ran down the path, the rain mingling with my tears. I slapped my hands against the window. "I will burn her whole kingdom down, Daniel." He pressed his cuffed hands against the glass from the inside. The car pulled away, lights flashing, disappearing into the wet night. I stood there in the middle of the street, soaked, shivering, and filled with a rage so pure, so hot, that I felt like I could dry the rain with my breath. Margaret thought she had won. She thought that by taking him away, she would break me. She thought I was just the poor girl from the mechanics district who got lucky. She forgot one thing. I wasn't just Daniel's wife. I was a mother, and I was a daughter of this neighborhood. We don't break when we get hit. We fight back. I turned around and walked back to the house. My father was holding my mother, who was crying softly. "Dad asked," his voice shaking. I walked past them, into the kitchen. I picked up the phone. I didn't call the lawyer first. I called Jose. Jose answered on the first ring. "Release it," I said, my voice dead calm. "Release Everything. The accounts, the photos, the emails, Jose guessed. Then let's start a riot, Jose said. I hung up the phone. I looked at the empty chair where Daniel had sat this morning, eating fried dough and laughing. Okay, I whispered to the empty room. Okay. The rain didn't stop. It felt as though the sky itself was weeping for the injustice of it all, washing over the tire tracks where the police car had taken my husband. My father stood on the porch, his hand gripping the wooden railing so hard his knuckles were white, resembling the old, gnarled roots of the oak tree in the yard. "Come inside, Lucia," my mother whispered, her voice cracking. She tried to drape a shawl over my soaked shoulders, but I barely felt the cold. The fire inside me was too hot. "They took him, Mama," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, hollow yet hard as iron. I walked back into the kitchen. The smell of the fried sopapillas, which had been a scent of joy just an hour ago, now turned my stomach. It smelled like a memory of a happiness that had been stolen. I looked at the phone on the wall. It was a lifeline. "Garrus is meeting us at the station," my father said, walking in behind me. He had already put on his good Sunday jacket, the one with the patch on the elbow that Mom had sewn with invisible stitches. He said to bring the recording. I looked at him. "The public doesn't care about spreadsheets, Mija," Dad said, his eyes wise and tired. "They care about a grandmother throwing her grandchildren onto the street." He was right. We left the children with my mother. Lily was awake, sitting up in the bed, her eyes wide and terrified. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. I knelt beside her, ignoring the water dripping from my hair onto the floorboards. I took her small, warm face in my hands. "Daddy is a hero, Lily. Sometimes bad people try to stop heroes, but I am going to get him." I kissed her forehead, inhaling the scent of baby shampoo and innocence, the smell that Margaret Hamilton had tried to throw away like garbage. The drive to the precinct was a blur of neon lights reflecting on wet asphalt. My father drove his battered pickup truck, the engine wheezing with every gear shift. It was a stark contrast to the silent, leather-clad luxury of the cars I had ridden in for the last 7 years. But this truck felt real. It felt like struggle. It felt like us. When we arrived, the station was already a circus. Jose had not wasted a single second. There were vans with satellite dishes. There were photographers huddled under umbrellas. And there were people, regular people from the neighborhood, holding makeshift signs. "Look at that," my father whispered, pointing through the windshield. We pushed through the crowd. Cameras flashed in my face, blinding me. Microphones were shoved toward me like spears. "Mrs. Hamilton!" I stopped at the top of the stairs. I turned to face them. I didn't have a PR team. I didn't have a script. I just had a broken heart and the truth. "My name is Lucia," I said, my voice projecting over the rain. "And yes, my mother-in-law, a woman worth billions, threw a 7-year-old girl out into the rain because her father refused to abandon us. My husband is in there because he told the truth. Margaret Hamilton thinks she can buy justice." I turned and walked inside, the roar of the crowd following me like a wave. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a headache-inducing hum. Mr. Garrus was there, looking like a disheveled bulldog in a cheap suit, arguing with a desk sergeant. Garrus was shouting, slamming a hand on the counter. "It's not hearsay. It's a sworn affidavit from the CEO," the sergeant replied boredly. Then the doors opened behind us. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The smell of expensive, cloying roses filled the stale air of the station. Margaret Hamilton walked in. She was flanked by 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than my parents' house. She was wearing a cream-colored trench coat, spotless, without a single drop of rain on her. She looked like a statue made of ice and arrogance. She saw me. Her lip curled, just slightly, a micro-expression of disgust she couldn't quite control. "Lucia," she said, her voice smooth as velvet and cold as a grave. "I see you've brought the circus." How typical. "I'm seeking my husband, Margaret," I said, stepping into her path. My father moved to stand beside me, a silent wall of protection. "Your husband is a criminal," Margaret said, pulling off her leather gloves, finger by finger. "He stole from the family. He betrayed the legacy." "Oh, spare me the telenovela dramatics," she scoffed, looking around the dingy station with disdain. "You've ruined him, you know. He had a bright future. Senate seats, boardrooms, and he threw it all away for—" She gestured vaguely at me, at my wet clothes, at my father's worn jacket. I shouted. Margaret laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound. Love doesn't pay the mortgage, dear. Love doesn't keep you out of prison. Power does. She turned to the station captain, who had just emerged from his office. "Captain, I want these people removed." The captain looked at Margaret, then at me. He looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Hamilton," the captain said slowly. "We," Margaret snapped, "process the booking." "We can't do that," the captain said. He picked up a tablet from his desk. "I don't look at the internet," Margaret spat. "Well," the captain said, clearing his throat, "it seems your son's interview with the local paper went viral about 20 minutes ago." Margaret went still. For the first time, the mask slipped. Her eyes flickered with something like fear. Garris, my lawyer, stepped forward with a grin that showed all his crooked teeth. He held up his phone. He pressed play. The sound was tinny, but clear enough. The silence of the station amplified it. "If Daddy signs that, I'm going with Mommy." The recording ended. Margaret's face turned a color I had never seen on a human being, a mix of gray and purple. That is out of context," she stammered. "There's more," the captain said, scrolling on the tablet. "Thousands of comments. People are canceling their accounts with Hamilton Trust. The stock has dropped 12% in the last hour." The captain looked at the door. "The district attorney just called. He doesn't want to touch this arrest with a 10-foot pole. He says it looks like—" How did he phrase it? Margaret shrieked, her composure shattered. The ice cracked. "I am Margaret Hamilton." "Not anymore," a deep voice said from the holding cell hallway. We all turned. Daniel was standing there. He was still in handcuffs, but the officer beside him was unlocking them. Daniel looked tired, his eyes shadowed, but when he saw me, his whole face lit up. He rubbed his wrists where the metal had bitten into his skin. He walked past his mother as if she were a piece of furniture. He came straight to me. "Lucia," he breathed, pulling me into a hug that squeezed the air from my lungs. I buried my face in his neck, smelling the stale scent of the cell mixed with his own familiar warmth. I sobbed, the relief crashing over me like a tidal wave. "I told you," I wept into his shirt. He kissed my hair, then turned to face his mother. Margaret was trembling. She looked small now. The cream trench coat suddenly looked like a costume that didn't fit. "You ungrateful boy," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "I gave you everything." "You made me a prisoner," Daniel said softly. He reached into his pocket. The officer had returned his personal effects and pulled out a set of keys. the keys to the penthouse, the keys to the luxury car, the keys to the executive elevator. He walked over to the counter and dropped them in front of Margaret. They clattered loudly on the laminate surface. "Keep it," Daniel said. "Keep the money, keep the house, keep the legacy. It's just dust, Mother." "You will starve," Margaret hissed, her eyes wild. "My mother is making tortillas right now," Daniel said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Get out of my sight," Margaret screamed. It was a raw, ugly sound. The sound of a woman who had spent her life building a tower of gold only to find herself trapped alone at the top. "Gladly," Daniel said. He took my hand. He took my father's hand, and we walked out. We walked out of the station, past the cameras, past the shouting reporters. We didn't stop to give interviews. We didn't stop to gloat. We just walked into the rain, which was finally beginning to soften into a gentle drizzle. When we got back to my parents' house, the neighborhood was awake. Lights were on in every porch. Mrs. Garcia from next door was standing on our lawn with a pot of tamales. Mr. Henderson from across the street had brought a bag of oranges. They weren't rich, they didn't have stocks or bonds, but they had come out in the rain because one of their own was in trouble. We walked into the house. It was warm. It smelled of coffee and cinnamon. And launched herself from the sofa. Daniel caught her, falling to his knees, burying his face in her small stomach. Leo toddled over and joined the pile, laughing because everyone else was crying. My mother stood at the stove, wiping her eyes with her apron. Okay, she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Enough crying. The coffee is fresh. Daniel, sit." We sat around the small Formica table. It was crowded. Our elbows touched. The chairs didn't match. The wallpaper was peeling in the corner. Daniel looked around the room. He looked at the tamales Mrs. Garcia had brought. He looked at my father, who was recounting the look on Margaret's face to a delighted Mr. Garris on the phone. He looked at Lily, who was drawing a picture on the back of an eviction notice, a picture of a house with smoke coming out of the chimney and 4 stick figures holding hands. Daniel reached under the table and found my hand. He interlaced his fingers with mine. His grip was strong. "I'm sorry about the inheritance," he whispered to me, so the kids wouldn't hear. "I really did lose it all, Lucia." I squeezed his hand back. I looked at the chaotic, loud, beautiful mess of a family crammed into that tiny kitchen. I looked at the love that filled the room so completely it felt like we could float. "Daniel," I said, leaning my head on his shoulder. He looked at Lily, laughing as she smeared bean paste on her brother's nose. He smiled, and tears finally spilled over, running down his cheeks, washing away the last of the Hamilton air. "No," he said, his voice breaking. The storm outside had passed. The old closet was closed forever. And for the first time in our lives, we were finally, truly, home.